Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. Here, we aim to bring you the experience, strength, and hope of professionals working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. Our mission is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a recognized disorder. Here, we discuss all things recovery, exploring the many pathways people take towards abstinence in order to achieve a health-forward lifestyle. We hope to inspire you to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, and share your journey with others. And hopefully the message will spread. Hey, Food Junkies listeners, Clarissa here, and today we have a fabulous episode for you. Today we're joined by Jan Winhall. She's a Toronto-based trauma therapist, educator, and the creator of the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model through the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model Institute. This model is a bottom-up, de-pathologizing framework that integrates polyvagal theory with felt sense focusing to support healing from trauma and addictive patterns through embodied safety, interoception, and relational repair. Jan is an educational partner and course developer with the Polyvagal Institute, and she is author of Treating Trauma and Addiction with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model and 20 Embodied Practices for Healing Trauma and Addiction. Jan brings together three game-changing lenses: polyvagal theory, how our nervous system shifts through safety, mobilization, and shutdown; the felt sense, our inner embodied knowing; and a deeply de-pathologizing view of trauma and addiction, one that sees symptoms not as what's wrong with you, but as what your body learned to do to survive. And this is exactly why her work is so essential in food addiction recovery, because for so many people, food isn't a willpower problem. It's a state regulation strategy. When the nervous system flips into threat, the body reaches for whatever reliably shifts the state, up out of numbness, down out of overwhelm, or away from shame. Jan's model helps people slow that whole loop down in real time, building safety first, restoring interoception and trust in the body, and making room for real change that isn't just cognitive, it's physiological. So if you've ever wondered why insight or meal plans or just try harder can still leave people stuck, this conversation is the missing piece. Jan helps us understand the nervous system patterns underneath compulsive eating, why shame locks the system down, and how healing happens through presence, co-regulation, and embodied practices that gently bring the body back to safe enough. These are all things we practice in sweet sobriety. And so we were so excited to have this conversation with Jan, and we can't wait to find ways to work with her more in the future. Enjoy this episode, so many takeaways, and let us know what you think. Jan, we are so excited to have you here with us today. We are really wondering, for listeners who may be new to your work, can you share a little bit about what Felt Sense Polyvagal Model is and what inspired you to bring trauma, addiction, and embodied knowledge all together in this way?
That's a big question.
It is a big one. But usually we say, tell us about you and who you are. But I feel like this is going to accomplish that too.
That's exactly true. Yeah. So about 45 years ago now, I graduated from graduate school and I got this job in a hospital, a small hospital, community hospital north of Toronto. And one of my jobs that I was assigned was running a group for young women who were incest survivors. And it was an incredible experience, very hard to be with, painful, but also, most of what I learned that I'm going to share with you now came really from the foundations from that group, from really seeing the limitations of the traditional psychiatric model, limitations and harm, the harm that was done to these women, because the current model was one that was really pathologizing them. And I saw them as victims of crime. Yeah. And frankly, they were treated with contempt. I mean, the upside of that for me was that they basically just said, go do your thing. And so they left me alone. And because I had been in therapy myself, and I was lucky, I found an amazing therapist when I was young. I was, I think, 17 or something. I knew how the healing process felt from the inside. And I knew how to listen. And also my mother was a very strong feminist, and that was a gift. Because although my mom had lots of issues, that was a real gift. And it's rare for a woman in my generation to have a mom that was such a staunch feminist. So the paradigm shift was very comfortable for me. I was used to working in different paradigms. And so from a feminist lens, I saw the way these women were being treated with misogyny. And so I went looking around, and I found the beautiful work of people like Judith Herman, Trauma and Recovery, she wrote. If your listeners haven't read it, I mean, it's just an exquisite book. It's every bit as good today as it was when it came out in the early 90s, I think, the 1990s, and other wonderful feminist therapists. And I really soaked up what they were talking about, which was about establishing safety, the precursor to understanding and really valuing polyvagal theory. And so I learned how to notice what was going on for them in their bodies, really, because you could see the struggle in the way that they would shift from this really anxious, what we would call now sympathetic flight-fight response in the nervous system, into shutting down and dissociating and numbing. And I could see that. And we called it back then, we called it numbing and flooding. You know, beautiful, right? Embodied language for what was going on. And we also called triggers these fresh, frozen places. You know, they were frozen in time, the triggers, but when you poked them, they were like fresh, like it was happening right now, the trauma, right? And so I learned from Sandra Butler, who wrote the first book, The Conspiracy of Silence, book on incest. Incredible woman. And she had a totally de-pathologizing approach. She said, when women show up and they're presenting with borderline personality disorder, which we all know very well these days, what they're doing is just showing you what they learned to do to survive. Again, another very polyvagal informed statement that these responses of binging and purging, for example, with food addiction, food dysregulation, and lots of other ways, you know, cutting the body, all these ways that were understood as manipulative, attention-seeking, kind of suicidal prompts, all of that stuff. She understood those as ways of trying to regulate. She wouldn't have said a dysregulated nervous system, but we would have talked about it in terms of emotion dysregulation for sure. Yeah. So that's what got me on the path. And then I found Gendlin's work, the father of the felt sense. You know, everybody's talking about the felt sense, but people don't really understand what that is. They think it's sensation, and that it is partly sensation, but it's much more than that. We can get into that. So I studied with him for over 30 years. I mean, what a gift to have met that community, the focusing community, focusing.org, if people don't know it. And I learned how to really be with people in a very deeply embodied way, to work through and reprocess the trauma. And then I found polyvagal theory, you know, I guess 2012, I first met. I didn't meet Steve Porges personally then, but I met his work and Dan Siegel's work, Interpersonal Neurobiology. I went to a conference and I was just so excited and really started to delve into their work. And then it just started to flow together that the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model is really, it's a somatic foundation. So you can bring in neuroception, which is Steve Porges' word for the process in the body, the unconscious process in the body of noticing how safe we are and shifting into a nervous system state that helps us to survive given how safe we feel. So it's a wonderful word, and isn't so interesting that in this really top-down cognitive world that we live in, we don't have words for these kinds of bodily processes. So Steve gave that beautiful unconscious process. I mean, imagine, you know, our body is just all the time scanning for safety and danger, just right now as we're talking, right? And so that process we look at, and then we also look at interoception and the felt sense, which is Gendlin's words that he made up as well, because there wasn't a word for that either. This embodied process of sensing how we're experiencing the world from inside our bodies, which of course is really limited and shut down in trauma because it hurts too much to connect in there. So we disconnect and numb. And then food, or whatever it is, drugs, alcohol, sex, whatever it is, but in your world, the food addiction is all about using these jolts to the body, either through, binging or purging, really powerful experiences in the body that shift the body from this overwhelming, uncomfortable, constricted flight-fight state down into a dissociated place in the nervous system or back again. And that is so interesting how that works, right? Because it can go either way, depending on what the body needs in order to survive. So really important to remember or to learn, I learned this from Steve Porges, that our bodies cannot stay in one of those nervous system states forever. So we can't stay in that sympathetic state because it's too metabolically taxing on the body. The heart rate's, going like crazy. So adrenaline and cortisol. And we also can't stay in a numbed, dissociated state. This is the branch of the vagus nerve that Steve Porges named as the dorsal branch, the shutting down branch. And that was, I think, was certainly one of the most important parts of polyvagal theory is Porges' naming of this other part of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve in the body. And when we feel safe enough, the ventral branch of the vagus is online and we're having a good time. We're socially connecting to each other like now, right? But if we don't feel safe, the first place the body goes to is mobilizing, either to run away or to fight back. And if we can't do either of those things, the body shuts down and numbs out and dissociates. So how we understand addictive behaviors from a polyvagal lens is that they are state regulation strategies. They help us to shift from one of those threatened responses to the other or back again. And we have to do that in order to sustain life. So if you numb for too long in dissociated dorsal branch of the vagus, the heart rate goes so low you can die. And that's how Steve discovered that branch of the vagus, was because he was studying premature babies who were sick. And you would expect, if there was no dorsal branch of the vagus, it wasn't part of that traditional autonomic nervous system before Porges. There was only safety and flight-fight. And when he was working with these premature babies and they died, you would think, well, their heart rate wouldn't be steady because they're really ill and they're preemies. You would think then that the heart rate would be really rapid, but it was the opposite. The heart rate was lower. And that's what made him very curious. So he said, what is that about? Because it's not the ventral branch. The body wasn't feeling safe. And that's what led to this understanding that there's another path of that vagus nerve. And that was the shutting down that we all, as trauma therapists, we all saw that. We knew it. And that's why I think polyvagal theory caught on like fire, right? It was like, oh yeah, we know that place in the body. And then when I understood, I put it together. It's like, so this in focusing, we talk about this felt shift in the body that would happen, that if we helped people to stay with what was really uncomfortable, as long as we also grounded enough safety in the body, that somehow that being with what was so uncomfortable and learning to titrate it very, very carefully. So not to just jump in and freak people out, but to take our time to first connect with some safety. And that can take a long time. But we do that first. It's very important. And then help people to basically reprocess the trauma And that if we do that in the right way, where people co-regulate with us and they feel respected and heard, and that they restore or find a sense of dignity in themselves in relating with us, that's the healing journey, really. And when that happens, the body will then shift into that gorgeous, safe ventral branch of the nervous system. And that's what I put together in the model, was that these two processes are intimately woven together. How we're experiencing our life, and then what happens in our nervous system, and what happens in our nervous system and how we're experiencing our life. It's like a feedback loop. And so what we called the felt shift in the focusing world, I realized was a shift into a ventral state in the nervous system. And then I was just fortunate enough to meet Steve Porges back in 2018. And I said, I think that these behaviors, binging and purging and cutting, and they're ways of like shifting those states back and forth. And he said, yeah, absolutely. So that was then I realized, okay, I've got something here.
No, I love it so much, Jan. You are speaking our language, about safety is what we are constantly speaking to our clients about. And I feel like the way you speak about this is how when I first heard Deb Dana really explain Stephen's work, because, it's a lot to take in. And
Yeah.
she was kind of like the original translator. At least
Yeah.
for me, I felt,
Yeah.
okay, this makes it approachable. And then I found your work and I was like, you are like the Deb Dana of like this field. And you're taking like all the concepts of Stephen and applying them to trauma addiction. It made so much make sense, right? It's like for so long, people in this addiction field have been demonizing the behaviors, right?
Yeah, that's a mistake.
Really, the behaviors are the solution to what's really going on for them. Before we dive into the rest of the questions, we get a lot of questions from people we work with about, if I am not activated by trauma, do I need to go back and like look for trauma? And I'm just curious about like your take on this.
Well, this is the other part of the work, is Jenlen's work with somatics, with the body. And no, we don't go fishing for trauma, but if we know how to help a person come into their body, which is not happening in the state of addiction, then when we know how to help them to connect into something that feels alive and safe inside, then we work with whatever is there. So there's going to be something there that is a problem. Otherwise, they wouldn't be stuck in an addictive state, because that addictive state is part of what we call the trauma feedback loop. And there's no really solid ventral safe energy there. So we just go with what is happening inside the body. And sometimes in the beginning, people will be able to slow things down a little bit and begin to feel into the extremities of the body, maybe the fingertips or your earlobes or your nose. And you can imagine that there's probably a lot of stuff going on in the center of the body that feels really overwhelming and scary. But we don't go there until we can anchor something that feels like you can hold on to it. And no, we don't go fishing. We used to do that. 45 years ago, we went fishing and we hurt people. We didn't mean to, but we didn't know. That's how I went searching, because in Toronto here, there were one or two people who were working with incest survivors in the city, as well as us in the hospital. But when I referred to them, they were wonderful people trying to really be helpful. But when I referred to them, my people would come back and they would have had horrible experiences of re-traumatizing each other in the groups and vomiting. And oh my God, it was terrible. So that was when Judith Herman, we were all like so anticipating, what do we do? How do the sort of deep dive into somatic work didn't work with these women. And so when her book came out and she said, oh, we need these 3 phases of healing, right? The first phase, people still talk about it. The first phase, establishing safety. That's so polyvagal, right? The second phase was remembering and mourning. So that's where you would do the uncovering work, not fishing though. And then the third phase of reconnecting to the world in a new, fresh way. not through the eyes of the survivor, but through fresh ways of being in the world, showing up in the world. Yeah. We've learned a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. And I imagine some of that has come alongside like new neuroscience as well as, right, some of the stuff that's developing in the field of psychology and psychiatry and mental wellness in general too. And it makes me think about, I always say, like, in my past life, I was a traditional talk therapist. Like, I cut my teeth and, in corrections. And so it was all cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive principles and restructuring and motivational interviewing, some of those quote gold standard, types of therapy. And I realized early on a lot of what you recognized as well, right? Here we are re-traumatizing people. I don't know that them talking about their trauma in this kind of way is helpful or healing them in any kind of way. But yet we do that, right? Like, the gold standard is this cognitive approach. And I think we find too with our clients, like, they like to be there. They like to do the cognitive stuff because they don't have to drop in. And so, they want to be given a diet plan or, a food plan. They want you to give them answers, the strategies, tell me the tools, the tips, the tricks. And yet they often remain stuck. And so can you kind of draw that parallel for them or make that connection as to why, integrating into the body and the nervous system is actually a missing part of maybe their equation on their journey?
Yeah, and an essential part, because, this is the piece that Deb talks about, story follows state, right? And I think that's true. Story does follow state. We can talk about that. But I think it also goes the other way. That state also follows story. It's a loop, right? It's a feedback loop. Yeah. So whatever nervous system state our body is in, if we just think about those three main pathways, and there are, of course, lots of blended states, so it gets more complicated, but not to go there at first. And actually, I have a graphic model that I use. And it's called the 7Fs, 7 states that we talk about in the Polyvagal Institute. And I find it really helps people because you can see the shape and the color of the nervous system in the body. And we developed it all through focusing. So we did not develop it through thinking about what does an image for flight, fight look like up here. We took it down into the body. So if we just slow it down a little bit now and your listeners can just reflect, like, imagine how different it is for us when we're walking down the street and we're feeling safe. That's the ventral branch of the vagus nerve. So it's above the diaphragm and up through into the face and around the ear. That part of the vagus nerve is activated when we feel safe enough, because God, the world is crazy right now. Really crazy. And so we do have to work at that, right? Finding these moments where we can feel okay, safe enough. And when we feel like that, and say somebody bumps into you, this is the intervening variable Steve Porges talks about. Somebody bumps into you and you feel not too bad. You might sort of say, oh, it's okay. Don't worry about it. It's nothing, and carry on. But if you're walking down the street and you feel fight, you're mad, you just woke up on the wrong side of the bed and somebody bumps into you, how does your body respond to that? Hey, what's going on? What did you do that for, stupid? So it's a completely different response that we have, not just based on our experience, but based on our physiology. And if we're walking down the street and we feel kind of depressed and sluggish and heavy and kind of out of it, dissociated, and somebody bumps into us, we might not really even notice. So all of that response is first and foremost determined unconsciously by how safe our body feels in the world. And without that awareness, we're really limited in terms of how we can change our behavior. Once we harness that awareness, we teach people, these are the different nervous system states, and what does it feel like in your body? And then you can recognize and rewire those nervous system states and shift and invite a little more grounded ventral energy into your body by doing very simple things. The most simple and direct is through breath. So if you find yourself wired up like that, right? So often when we're struggling around addiction, wired up like that and constricted, taking 3 breaths in, 3 inhalations in, and then 5 out. So extending the exhalation breath is just such a simple, powerful way to begin to slow things down a little bit.
I love that so much. And I see you like keep clenching your fists. And I always talk in group about how like tension is protection, right? And it really is just that sign that like, I'm needing to do something to take care of body in this.
To mobilize.
Yes.
To move. Yeah.
Yes. And
then when we can't move, shutting right down into shame, right? Hibernating into, yeah.
Yeah. And oh my gosh, I want to go to so many places right now. I get so excited about this.
Me too.
So yeah, let's go to shame actually, because we have a lot of individuals we work with and their behaviors around food, they feel like a deep shame about. And when we're in shame, we're very shut down. It's really hard to be compassionate and curious and open. And so how do you work with people? Because shame is a huge part in addiction, in mental health, and in trauma. And so how do you work with people with this model around shame?
Well, that's the part of it that's so much fun. People think I'm crazy. They think I am crazy when I talk like that, See, a lot of the people, you must know, you know this. I mean, people don't want to work with addiction. They're like, ooh, if somebody asks me, like you go to a party or a gathering or something, somebody says, oh, what do you do? If I say, oh, I'm a trauma therapist, I go, oh, if I say, oh, I'd work with addiction, they're like, oh.
I will say this, what's so interesting is I used to have the same conversations, whether it was on the plane or whatever.
Yes.
What was interesting is when I said I'm now like an expert in food addiction, every single person said, oh, so am I? Tell me more.
Yeah.
But shame, nobody wants to work with shame. It's heavy. It's so scary. It feels like if I go there, will I ever come back from that?
Yeah. Well, that's the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve. That's the part of the body that just shuts down and hides and feels so bad about themselves. And so the great thing about understanding addictions as adaptive state regulation strategies when the body's under threat is that you can say to your people, this is just what bodies do. There's nothing unique about you, Joe Blow. You're not unique. You're not bad. You're not dumb. You're not sick. It's just what every body does when it is under this level of threat. You are just like everybody else who experiences in their own experiencing, not some external definition of trauma, but their own embodied experience of trauma, that life is too overwhelming. Then bodies will shut down. That is what we are instinctively designed to do. So there's nothing unique about you. Sorry. And then when you believe that, like the key really is that you have to believe that. You can't just think it's an interesting idea. You have to believe it in your own body, which means doing this work means doing your own work. So in my training, the first year is all about doing your own work, applying the model to your own life and your own embodied process. And when you get that, it leads to being able to reframe people's shame into a natural, instinctive process that is in every body that is designed to keep us alive. And when people really get that and they feel it in you, they start to feel it in themselves. And you can see when it happens. And it's the most powerful way of healing shame that I've ever come across. When you just understand, oh my God, this is how nature designed us, is that you can't live in one of those dysregulated states or the other. People have to really get that. You will die. So you find these ways that are like jolts to the body that Judith Herman talked about, like cutting. Cutting's a really interesting one, and binging and purging too, because either way, it's like if you cut the body and you ask the person, what happens for you then? For some folks, it will shift them from sympathetic into dorsal because the body releases these endogenous opioids. Surprise, surprise, that people get addicted to opioids. And it brings the only relief they have. So there are times when I think some of the top-down cognitive stuff is quite helpful in reprocessing and helping people to understand in retro, thinking afterwards, reflecting on it, what happened before I binged? And then how did I feel after I binged? And tracing the nervous system state and how connected they are to their integrated felt sense of experience. And when they start to really understand those patterns, it's quite significant. And it really brings what we call moments of liberation for people. And when we work so much in groups, that's also is like so invigorating for people to feel that little turbo engine of connection with the group, And I often talk to people about how, often when people have food and sex addiction, it starts really early on in life, right? When there is a lot of trauma going on, because those are the two things that are available to people. Masturbation is free. Everybody has a body. And also usually with food, not always. I mean, sometimes food is restricted right away, but the fridge is there. You can kind of hide, grab, So when we're looking at food and sex addiction, we really want to be thinking about trauma, underlying trauma. Yeah.
Can we just move in with you, or do you want to move in with us? I just feel and Clarissa's laughing so hard right now, but I mean, I think Clarissa and I often feel like lonely islands in our field, because we do come from, right, this background of trauma, therapy, that kind of thing that we bring to the food addiction world. And the food addiction world is so new, and there's no, there's no research on, or very, very little research on treatment and all of that. And so we are cobbling it together based on what we know of other substance use disorders, process addiction, mental health, that kind of thing. And I would join your party. I'm all about the shame work. I love the shadow work. That is my, that's where I feel the best at what I do, is that place, because I'm not afraid of it. And I love to hear you describe your work as well, because you're not afraid of it, right? When we can sit with it long enough and see what it really is, it's pain, it's hurt, it's these things. And when you talk about food and sex addiction and how they start so early for people, because that's what we had access to, that also helps take the shame out of it, because, so many people say, why can't I get this thing figured out? And the truth of the matter is because it's pain. It's not the food addiction. It's not the food. It's not this compulsive behavior over and over again. It's the stuff that's driving it. And I just so appreciate, how you've described that and how you just normalize it. And I say that to people all the time too. I said, oh, welcome to Earth, species human. We are all literally biologically wired to have these responses, but you've come from therapists, programs, books, somewhere that said, no, this is unique to you because you're an addict, right? So it's constantly weaponized against the people that we work with. And so we have to do so much work to just kind of overcome that trauma sometimes.
Well, that's very, very true. And I've just actually started teaching about that. We just had a polyvagal conference. And one of the things that I've started to talk about is the trauma of addiction treatment. And, that's a terrible thing, but it's very true. I think our work would be so much easier and there would be so much less addiction if we were living in a culture that had genuine empathy for struggling to soothe yourself. I mean, who has never struggled to soothe themselves, And yet I think it's the hypermasculine world that we live in. So we need to get underneath these things to the systemic problems, right? It's so much of it is misogyny and hypermasculinity. So many guys that also have food addiction, and they don't talk about it at all because they feel like it's something women are supposed to have. And but what I found in doing this work for so long is that many guys have food addiction, and it goes together with those early masturbation histories. And then that develops and just gets more and more out of control as the decades go on. And those guys too, we don't talk about that enough. Those guys need help. So I love what you say, Molly, about not being afraid of the shadow work, because that really, it just makes life so much more interesting too. When I don't know about you, but I get addicted to those British detective series and whatever, where they're really exploring, not in a superficial way, but a really interesting way, like what's underneath the kind of evil acts and who is that person. And this work brings us into all of those, really murky domains. And I don't want to underestimate Jenlyn's work either, because Jenlyn was a real foundation person in somatics. And we really need to do a lot of education around that too. Although I think it's way better than it was 45 years ago. But we can't just be working with the nervous system. We have to also help people work with their own lived experience and understanding, how to deeply listen to another person.
Exactly. I think we've come from this culture of therapy stepping into what's wrong with them. And what we really need to be looking at is what happened to them? And being able to hold that compassionate space. And I wonder, how do we start to implement some of this compassion into the addiction field treatment? Because, even within the 12 steps, right?
I'm doing it.
I know. I read that. I saw your book and I read the book, and then I was immediately started exploring everything.
Well, read my first book, because this book is actually a manual for the first book that goes much more into depth into those different 5 different theories in the model. But yeah, I am doing it now, and it's really exciting. I've just started my own FSPM Institute, Felt Sense Polyvagal Model, and we're running courses based on the 20 embodied practices, and merging with groups. This one group that I just love called Friendly Circle Berlin, which is a group led by Patrick McTeer, and they're mostly folks that have been in 12-step groups, but they're curious for more ways of understanding. And so Patrick started this group maybe 5 years ago or so when he was living in Berlin. But I do this thing once a month. It's free. It's called Somatic Mondays. And they're also reading my book. They have a book study. And so we're trying to really bring communities together like yours and start to really establish alternative treatment models. Yeah.
And then I just want to touch on one more piece, which I think is critical to our audience, which is ADHD. So neurodivergence and addiction and
huge overlap.
Regulation. And I saw you just had a neurodivergent panel. I got the recording. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but can you explain to the listener, if I'm somebody with ADHD, why this work can be so much more challenging?
More challenging and really, really also very relevant. So, a person that is experiencing themselves as neurodivergent is perhaps inherently going to struggle with regulation. And certainly, like we were saying with addiction, living in this kind of culture of heteronormativity where everybody has to be the same is also going to feel outcast, weird, different. Even just when you think about the concept of time with an ADHD brain and our kind of very linear, left hemispheric, logical ways of organizing time in our top-down Western culture, boy, talk about shame, because people, often neurodivergent folks, have a really different experience of time and often are much more comfortable with kind of the less linear ways of seeing things, which is part of why I'm very attracted to that world. We did 2 panels, actually. The first one was with Sean Inderbitson, and he just wrote a book on polyvagal autism in polyvagal terms. Yeah. So those 2 things together. So you've got shame around your ADD brain, which is in many ways a wonderful, creative, gorgeous brain, but in our culture isn't accepted and people are shamed for it. So then, of course, you're going to feel threatened. You're not going to feel safe in this culture. It doesn't understand you. And why aren't you like Joe? or hairy, or why aren't you like your brother? And so shame then shifts us into that shutting down state, that dorsal branch of the vagus nerve, where we feel depressed and sad and numb and like giving up. And then we can't stay there. So then we shift back up into the dopamine rushing part of the brain that ADHD is drawn to because of that deficit, up into flight fight. So then we're already in that sympathetic branch because we're looking for dopamine to be able to help us. And we can't stay there. So we shift back down into shame and then back up. So there's no surprise as to why addictions occur there, because we know with neuroplasticity, if you travel down that same pathway, again, back and forth from flight fight into shutting down and then back again and back again and back again, you're going to develop what we call that neuroplastic paradox, where you're stuck in a rut. And that literally is the pathway of addiction. So the good news is we can move out of those pathways with very purposeful practices that bring us into more safety in the body.
So we have clients who really struggle with also body image.
Of course.
So I think something I want to make sure, because like their body's the enemy, right? So how do I find a way in to this work, the felt sense, to be able to rebuild trust? Like how, when, my body is the problem?
Yeah. So that's, again, we live in such a misogynistic culture. So a lot of that, I think, has to do with our own presence and how we feel about our bodies, because we know that bodies co-regulate. So how I feel, even across the screen, how I feel about my aging body. Can I love my aging body that's gained some weight that never used to be there, that has this or that? How do I feel about myself? And without even speaking about it, we impart that whole felt sense of how we relate to our own bodies as women. And I think that's the most important way. And then we can look for little avenues to do a little bit of educating around that. If the person can hear it, often in the beginning, they don't hear it at all. But I think a lot of that has to do with the relationship that we build with people, with women, especially young women, because we have to remember that I believe that inside every body, there is a willingness and a desire to heal. And that vision is shared by Gendlin's work and certainly by Steve Porges' work. That part of the ventral branch of the vagus nerve, when we feel safe enough, this is the place in the body that knows how to heal itself, both psychologically through the practice of deep listening and compassion, and also through the nervous system, shifting into when we create enough safety. So the main thing in the beginning to work on is establishing presence and safety, so you have some credibility. And remembering that people do want to heal. Even if they show up and they don't feel it in themselves, they're there. Unless they're court mandated, there is a part of them that brought them there. So you want to speak to the part of them that brought them there. And you can ask them, what part of you brought you here? Because the thing about the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model is that you can incorporate any other kind of modality into the model. You're simply bringing the body, the nervous system, and interoception into however you're working. So it works very nicely with parts and with other more protocols like EMDR and whatever. Yeah. So I think that's the hardest part in a way, is when we can start to educate a little bit around misogyny, but only when we've really got the ear of the person. Yeah. And that takes time with young women, the pressure, and guys too now. Yeah.
It really is the hardest. And in our field, our demographic is actually much older, if you can imagine that. So I would say 45, 50 and older is typically who we see. And some of that is because the progression of something like food addiction is much slower when we compare it to something like methamphetamine or opioids or something.
And you can
along those
hide
lines.
it so easily.
Right. It can be, kind of fobbed off as like, oh, haha, I'm a alcoholic. And everybody else is like, yeah, me too. Pass the whatever. Right. So it takes a while longer, for people to kind of end up in our space. But one thing that I have really noticed is, we take a lot of time. We've built this community, this safe enough idea, right? We want to have this container where people feel safe enough to express, in like a parallel processing experience of like, hey, when you shared that thing, then this came up for me, all of that. But what I still find really interesting is the clients for which, when they feel safe enough that they're sharing, they're in this vulnerable place, but yet something feels really painful to hear back, something, and not that it's like a painful thing necessarily in like the traditional sense that we might think this, right? It's more like, hey, you shared this thing, so-and-so, and that was really important for me to hear. Thank you so much for being a great role model in the community, or something along those lines. And that's really painful for the person to hear. And it's this interesting kind of, I guess, like process that we have to walk through with people. And I just wonder if more of embodiment would be helpful in those kinds of, cases where it's easy for them to receive negative feedback, but when they are hearing positive feedback or getting positive connection from community members, it literally is painful for them.
So can you give me an example of that?
Yeah. So I mean, like, I'm thinking of a couple women in general from group where, like they'll share, and then somebody will say like, wow, like that was so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing, your past experience, or, or even just telling them, hey, my experience of you as a person is a good person, a big-hearted person, a loving person, whatever.
So when they're receiving something that is like a compliment or
love, right?
Or love. Yeah, of course. Because that, of course, brings us into that ventral branch of the vagus where we feel safe enough. That's the social engagement system. It brings us into closeness and intimacy. And that is very threatening to an addicted body. Yeah, because an addicted body is avoiding that kind of social engagement that brings intimacy, because that's where we've been hurt. That's where we've been let down and wounded. So the body will avoid it. But the great thing about understanding the nervous system is that we can help ourselves by knowing that. We can learn to override that nervous system state, which is what's so great about the healing. We can say, in this moment, it feels really scary to hear that, and normalize it. In this moment, how is it for you, Sally, when, Sue says that? And let's notice that it can be really uncomfortable and scary because our body feels threatened by that kind of intimacy. And then we can kind of update our nervous system and say, well, let's think about it. This is a cognitive now kind of process, top down. Actually, am I safe enough here? Do I know Sally enough that I can actually begin? And then I would slow it right down to feel a little bit of that warmth coming from Sally. Is it okay? Does it feel okay to do that? And teaching a lot about how triggers manifest, that we do have what we call habitual neuroception. Some people call it faulty neuroception. We're trying to really de-pathologize the language. We never use the word disorder. We talk about adaptations, but we can really slow that down and do a little teaching piece, over and over again around triggers and habitual neuroception. So the body will get triggered. It will be fresh frozen. It will go into shut down and avoid. And then let's see if we can reprocess that. And then those moments will happen in the group, and then you can bring them alive and say, here we are in one of those, things we were talking about the other day where, habitual neuroception. And you can also even just make a joke out of it. Sometimes, not always, of course, not always, but as people heal, and then sharing our own stories, being able to say, that thing 5 years ago, I would have been right into a big hole. And now I can start to see, I can hold both, like dual consciousness. I can hold both ways of being with something. And you can feel it in the body. I can hold the trauma of the old way and then wanting to really avoid you. It's down here in my belly. But I also kind of feel that warm connection, and it's sort of up here. And this is where we work with kind of blending those felt sense experiences, right? And really encouraging more of the body to come into that feeling of safe enough. Yeah.
Oh, I love that so much. It's definitely something that we get to experience in group, and we really get to see the shift, right? In clients, which I think is what we enjoy so much about this.
Of course. Yeah. And teaching them too, right? There's your body knows that feels good.
It's like drawing attention to it. And I also love what you shared there about self-disclosure and how it can be such a safe, powerful tool, and how, in traditional therapy, it was like, we don't let anybody know who we are. We're the professional there, and this different way of being, it creates safety.
Yes, we need to be. Well, I love this. Steve would often talk about this. He said the greatest gift you can give another person is your accessibility. And so I'm really trying to do that, even though we're getting bigger, to really stay accessible to people. It's very important. And, in self-disclosure, to, of course, not to be just like blurting out. And, we have to do it with care. We have to make sure people know that they're held.
Right. Safe self-disclosure is important.
Yeah.
Right.
So having some sense of vulnerability as a healer, but also, the client knowing that they can fall back on you and you're not going to fall over.
Right. And so again, that importance of doing your own work in order
huge
for somebody else.
Yeah. Well, I am so delighted to hear you're doing this work because, as you well know, it's rare.
Yeah.
And come and find us. At least join my community.
Oh, I'm going to.
I mean, please do. I really, the whole idea is that we can connect and we're greater in numbers.
Yeah.
In terms of really shifting the paradigm.
And we do have a lot of clinicians that listen to this show, as well as, people working on their food addiction sobriety. Where can they, everything you said today resonated deeply with them, where can they find you?
JanWinhall.com.
Okay. And your institute, right? As well.
Yeah, it's all part of my website. Yeah. So they can join the community and get my newsletter. And there's no reason there's nothing good comes from holding on to that shame place. It's just a terrible place to be. And I'm really committed to being bold about that. Like, we really are doing damage in the way we treat addiction, and it needs to stop.
Part of me we're both on the team working towards getting ultra-processed food addiction, food use disorder recognized, is to say, look, this is something we all struggle with, and normalize addiction in general. I think smash the stigma behind it, right? Because I think all, to some degree, we all have some level of it in some part of our lives. And for so many of us, we're still keeping it secret. And let's bring it into the light and just be these substances that we've been using are making sense. The behaviors are not the problem. And how can we all heal together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's hard. It's a big battle because there's a really big financial gain in holding on to addiction treatments that cost $30 or $40 or $90,000 US a month. So we have work to do, but that's why we have to do it together.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then we just have one final question, which is our signature question. And that is, if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about trauma and addiction recovery, what would you tell her?
I would tell her that if you do the work, it gets better. It works. I would tell her that it works. What we do works. It really does. Yeah. I am not the same person I was 40 years ago. And I did a lot of work.
Yeah. I'm not the same person I was a year ago.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here today.
That was a real treat. Thank you for having me. And please do come and join me.
Will do.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life Support Group, I'm Sweet Enough. Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals who offer one-to-one counseling and group coaching through Sweet Sobriety. Please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in today's episode, we'd appreciate you leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps grow our show and allows us to reach others who need to hear this message of recovery. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. And as Vera always says, the power is ours.